Welcome to Fluent Daily, the English listening channel for advanced learners at B2 and C1 level. Every episode features a rich, flowing conversation in natural English on a topic that is genuinely worth thinking about: history, psychology, science, philosophy, and more. There are no simplified sentences here, no slow speech, no vocabulary drills. Just real English spoken naturally on ideas that matter. This is Fluent Daily. Let's get into it.
Today we have a great story, so let's get started right now. So think about this for a second. For basically 290,000 years, the entire idea of, building a house, putting up a fence, and just staying in one single place, that would have seemed like a totally bizarre, incredibly dangerous experiment to a human being.
Oh, absolutely. It would have felt like a death sentence.
Right. And welcome to the deep dive. If you're joining us for the first time, our mission here is to take this massive stack of historical data and scientific research, anthropological records, and essentially extract the insights that actually change how you see the world.
And today's stack of research is a big one.
Yeah, it really is. Today, we are looking at human history through a lens that completely upends our sense of what is, normal. We are so conditioned to think of the last 10,000 years. So the era of settled agricultural civilization, cities, written laws, the Industrial Revolution, we think of that as the default human story.
Right, the baseline.
Exactly. But if you zoom out, that 10,000-year window is just this tiny, super recent anomaly in the 300,000-year timeline of anatomically modern humans. For the vast majority of our time on Earth, we didn't sit still. Moving wasn't some disruption to the baseline. Moving was the baseline.
It really forces a total paradigm shift in how we understand ourselves. I mean, if you look at the several million-year history of the entire Homo lineage leading right up to us, seasonal migration was just the fundamental condition of survival.
It was just what you did.
Yeah, exactly. The boundaries between communities were completely fluid. So the concept of a rigid border, or this idea that you belong to one specific patch of dirt and literally nowhere else, that's a very, very modern psychological construct.
Which is wild to think about.
It is. And today, we're going to connect the dots between ancient DNA, these massive historical expansions, forced displacements, and modern economics, just to figure out how the physical act of moving literally engineered the human species.
I love that. And I want to start right at the biological foundation of this because it highlights something so incredibly weird about us as a species.
Okay, lay on me.
Well, so about 60,000 years ago, Homo sapiens start expanding out of Africa, right? And they eventually reach every habitable landmass on the planet: deserts, mountain ranges, the Arctic, eventually the Americas.
Everywhere.
Right. But we pulled this off without the anatomical specializations that other animals just absolutely rely on to survive those extremes. Like, if you look at a camel, its body is literally custom built for the desert.
Right, the humps, the eyelashes, everything.
Yeah, and a polar bear is this highly specialized piece of biological hardware built for the freezing cold. But humans, we didn't evolve thick fur for the Arctic. We didn't evolve aquatic features to cross the oceans. Physically speaking, we are incredibly generic. We are essentially just like a tropical ape.
We are. And that lack of specialization is exactly what drove our success.
Yeah.
But you kind of have to understand the mechanics of why. Let's look at that tropical ape anatomy you mentioned. We actually do have one major physical adaptation, and it's that we are the sweatiest mammals on Earth.
Wait, the sweatiest?
Oh, yeah. We have millions of eccrine sweat glands. We traded our fur for the ability to dump heat really rapidly, which allowed our ancestors to engage in persistence hunting on the African savanna.
So literally just running prey to exhaustion in the middle of the day.
Exactly. But that brilliant adaptation for the heat that becomes a fatal flaw the second you migrate into a glacial environment. I mean, you cannot survive an ice age with naked, sweaty skin.
Right. So I take a polar bear and drop it in the Sahara Desert. It just dies because its hardware is locked to its environment. But humans manage to go everywhere. I'm trying to wrap my head around how we bypassed our own biological limits. It feels like we essentially act as a piece of generic hardware running a highly adaptable operating system.
That is a perfect way to conceptualize it. Instead of waiting for millions of years of natural selection to give us thick fur, which, might never happen, our operating system, our cognitive and behavioral flexibility allowed us to solve the problem externally.
Like wearing the fur of other animals.
Exactly. We hunted an animal that did have thick fur. We processed the hide using stone tools, and we wore it. We figured out how to control fire. We formed these really complex cooperative social networks to share the labor of survival.
So the shift from biological evolution to cultural and technological evolution is what allowed us to cross environmental boundaries that would stop literally any other species in its tracks.
Right.
But if we didn't have the physical tools baked into our bodies, our primary evolutionary advantage was essentially just our brain's ability to innovate, sure, but also it seems like we needed a massive dose of sheer stubbornness.
Stubbornness.
Yeah, like an unyielding, relentless motivational drive to just keep walking and see what's over the next mountain range. Like, why not just stay put?
Well, I wouldn't call it stubbornness exactly. It's more of a risk-reward calculation that's just baked right into our survival strategy.
Okay, how so?
When you lack the deep biological specialization to simply hunker down and weather a massive environmental collapse, say like a multi-year drought or a sudden shift in the ice sheets, your only viable survival mechanism is to pack up and find a new environment. Movement became our substitute for specialization.
Oh, wow. I never thought of it like that.
Yeah, so spreading across the entire planet in roughly 60,000 years, which is an absolute blink of an eye in geological time, it wasn't some accidental wandering.
It was deliberate.
Right, it was the deliberate manifestation of a species whose primary survival strategy was mobility. We are hardwired to seek new horizons when the current one fails us.
Okay, so if this drive to move is so foundational, we should be able to see the receipts, right? We should be able to physically track this mass dispersal. But how do we actually trace the footsteps of a small band of humans who walked out of Africa 60 millennia ago?
Well, for a long time, we honestly couldn't do it with any real precision. We had to rely almost entirely on archaeology.
Finding old pots and stuff.
Yeah, finding a stone tool here, a bone fragment there, and trying to piece together a map based on where things were buried. It was a lot of educated guesswork, supported by physical anthropology and linguistics. But the last 3 decades have seen a scientific revolution that completely rewrote the field.
The DNA revolution.
Exactly. The development of ancient DNA analysis and large-scale population genomics. We no longer have to guess. We can directly read the history of human migration written right into the genetic code of living populations, and crucially, from the extracted DNA of ancient remains.
And the genetic evidence firmly locks in the out-of-Africa hypothesis, right? That every living human on Earth descends from an ancestral population that left the African continent somewhere between 60,000 and 70,000 years ago.
Yep, that's the consensus. They probably crossed the Red Sea into the Arabian Peninsula or maybe moved along the southern coast of Asia.
But the thing that really stopped me in my tracks when reading the sources is the data on genetic diversity. African populations possess significantly greater genetic diversity than all non-African populations combined.
Yes.
Basically, every single person whose ancestors are from outside of Africa is just a genetic subset of that one original migrating group.
It is one of the most profound facts of human biology, honestly. And it operates on a principle geneticists call the founder effect.
The founder effect.
Right. To understand how it works, you have to picture the ancestral population in Africa as this vast pool of genetic variation built up over hundreds of thousands of years.
Okay.
When a small band of humans, maybe just a few thousand or even hundreds of individuals, crossed out of Africa, they only carried their specific, limited slice of that genetic variation with them.
I was actually trying to explain this to a friend recently, and I used this music analogy.
Let's hear it.
Think of the total genetic diversity within Africa as the master Spotify database. It has millions of tracks, every genre, incredible variety. The small group that migrated out of Africa essentially downloaded a few dozen of those tracks to their phone before they lost Wi-Fi.
That's good.
Right. And everyone outside of Africa, for the last 60,000 years, has essentially just been endlessly remixing those same few downloaded tracks.
I actually really like that analogy, but we have to push it a bit further to see the full picture.
Okay, push it.
So the master database in Africa didn't just stay static, right? It kept evolving, adding new tracks and genres over the last 60,000 years. Meanwhile, the groups that left experienced subsequent founder effects.
Oh, because they kept splitting up.
Exactly. As a subset of that initial group moved into Europe, and another subset moved into Asia, and eventually across the Bering Land Bridge into the Americas, they kept taking smaller and smaller playlists with them. This is why indigenous populations in the Americas, who are at the furthest end of that migration route, have lower genetic diversity than populations in Central Asia, who in turn have less than populations in Africa. Every major leap into new territory created a new genetic bottleneck.
That makes total sense. But as these populations were moving and bottlenecking, they were achieving things that honestly sound like science fiction.
I really do.
By about 50,000 years ago, genetic and archaeological evidence places humans in Australia. I want to pause on that because getting to Australia isn't like walking into Europe. It requires crossing up to 90 kilometers of open ocean.
Yes.
We are talking about the earliest evidence of seafaring in the human record. 50,000 years ago, people with literal Stone Age technology looked at a horizon of endless, terrifying water, built some sort of craft, and just went for it.
It requires a level of cognitive sophistication and cooperative planning that completely dismantles the old stereotype of primitive cavemen. I mean, to cross the Wallace Line, that's the deep-water trench separating the fauna of Asia from Australia, you can't just drift on a log.
Right, you die.
You'd absolutely die. You have to build a watercraft capable of surviving open ocean swells. You have to provision it with fresh water and food and navigate without sight of land.
The psychological leap required to push out into the unknown like that is just staggering. And what's fascinating is that as these incredibly capable modern humans spread out, reaching Australia by 50,000 years ago, and Europe by roughly 40 to 45,000 years ago, they didn't step into empty landscapes.
No, they certainly did not.
Right, this is where the clean, straight-line story of human expansion gets incredibly messy. Because when modern humans arrived in Europe and the Middle East, they ran into Neanderthals.
Yes, the locals.
And Neanderthals weren't just passing through. They had been living in Eurasia, adapting to the cold for hundreds of thousands of years. The old textbook narrative was always that we showed up, we were smarter, and we just drove them to extinction. But the DNA says something totally different.
The DNA revolutionized everything here. This leads directly to the Nobel-winning work of Svante Pääbo and his team at the Max Planck Institute.
Right, because extracting that DNA was a nightmare, wasn't it?
Oh, it was thought to be nearly impossible. Because over tens of thousands of years, DNA degrades into these tiny, fragmented, chemically damaged pieces. And it gets utterly contaminated by the DNA of soil bacteria and even the modern humans who handle the bones in museums.
Just from touching them.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So Pääbo's team basically had to invent new methods of operating in ultra-clean rooms, and they used advanced bioinformatics to stitch together millions of microscopic genetic fragments.
That's incredible.
It was a monumental achievement. And when they finally mapped the Neanderthal genome, they compared it to modern humans and found something shocking. Modern humans of non-African descent carry about 1 to 4% Neanderthal DNA.
So it wasn't just a violent replacement, it was an absorption. We encountered them and we interbred with them.
Exactly.
And Neanderthals weren't even the only ones. This brings up the Denisovans, which is honestly one of my favorite scientific discoveries of the last century. We found a completely distinct group of archaic humans, basically a sister group to Neanderthals, living in Asia. But we didn't find a whole skeleton.
No, not at all.
We discovered an entire branch of the human family tree from essentially just a single finger bone and a few teeth found in a cave in Siberia.
The Denisovan discovery is an absolute triumph of modern genetics. I mean, with Neanderthals, we had skulls and skeletons for a century before we had their DNA. With Denisovans, we had almost zero physical anatomy to look at.
What's a pinky bone?
Just a tiny fragment of a finger bone. We only knew they existed because the DNA extracted from that tiny bone didn't match Neanderthals, and it didn't match us. It was something new.
And we interbred with them too, right?
We did. Just like with Neanderthals, we find Denisovan DNA in living people today, specifically in Melanesian populations, Australian Aboriginals, and in varying degrees across Southeast Asia.
Wow.
Some populations in Tibet even inherited a specific Denisovan gene variant that helps them survive at high altitudes where oxygen is scarce.
That is wild. We outsourced our biological adaptation by interbreeding with a species that had already adapted to the environment.
Exactly. What this genomics revolution has taught us is that human history is not a neat tree with branches that never cross. It's more like a braided stream.
A braided stream. I like that.
Yeah, populations branch off, they isolate, they evolve, and then they flow back together and mix. Geneticists are even finding evidence of what they call ghost lineages in our DNA.
Wait, what is a ghost lineage? Because that sounds like the plot of a sci-fi movie.
It really does. A ghost lineage is a statistical footprint in our genetic code that points to an archaic human ancestor whose physical fossils we have never actually found.
Wait, really? So we don't have the bones at all?
No bones. Essentially, geneticists look at the DNA of living populations and find these anomalous segments of code that are too distinct to have come from Neanderthals, Denisovans, or early Homo sapiens. So the math dictates that this code must have been introduced by an unknown hominin species that interbred with our ancestors long ago.
That's amazing. We don't have their bones, but we carry their ghosts in our genome.
Exactly. It just proves how incredibly porous and complicated early human migrations were. We didn't conquer an empty planet. We walked into a crowded landscape and absorbed the locals.
Okay, so we have this mind-blowing initial spread out of Africa, crossing oceans, mixing with other hominins, and basically filling up the map. But the migrations that actually built the specific cultural, linguistic, and demographic world we live in today, those happened much, much later, right?
Yes, much later.
The initial wave was about survival, but how did the massive cultural blocks, the languages we speak and the societies we recognize, how did those actually take shape?
Well, to understand the architecture of the modern world, we have to move forward in time and look at the great gradual expansions. There is a common misconception about ancient migration.
What's up?
When we use the word migration, people tend to picture this cinematic event, right? An entire society packing their bags overnight and marching 1,000 miles like an invading army. But the migrations that truly rewired global demographics were usually extremely slow generation-by-generation processes.
So just moving a little bit at a time.
Exactly. We were talking about population expansion, intermarriage, and cultural diffusion that played out over centuries or even millennia.
Let's ground this with one of the most consequential expansions in history, the Yamnaya expansion.
Oh.
So around 3500 BCE, you have these Bronze Age pastoralists living on the Pontic-Caspian steppe, which is roughly modern-day Ukraine and southern Russia. And based on genetic evidence that was only solidified in the last decade, we know they exploded outward.
They absolutely did.
They are now considered the primary ancestors of Bronze Age Europeans. They contributed roughly 50% of the ancestry of contemporary Western Europeans and a massive chunk of the ancestry in Central and South Asian populations. And crucially, they brought Proto-Indo-European languages with them.
The linguistic legacy of the Yamnaya is almost impossible to overstate. Proto-Indo-European is the mother tongue from which English, Spanish, Russian, Hindi, Persian, and dozens of other languages evolved.
It's crazy to think about.
As they moved out of the Eurasian steppe beginning around 3000 BCE, they carried their genes and their vocabulary with them. But we have to look at the mechanics of why they were able to extend so successfully. It wasn't because they were inherently superior, It was because of their economic technology.
Right, because when I hear about a Bronze Age expansion from the steppes that permanently alters the genetics of half the world, my mind immediately jumps to Genghis Khan.
Naturally.
I picture this violent, hypermobile army on horseback, just pillaging and conquering their way across Europe. But you're saying this was a gradual demographic wave. How does a group of herders culturally and genetically overwhelm established farming communities without it being a massive military conquest?
It's all about carrying capacity and mobility.
Okay, explain that.
The Yamnaya were pastoralists. They had domesticated the horse, and they possessed wheeled wagons. They also had developed lactase persistence, which is the genetic ability to digest animal milk into adulthood.
Oh, so they could drink milk without getting sick.
Exactly. This meant they could extract immense amounts of calories from the tough grasses of the steppe by using cattle and sheep as biological converters. A farming community is tethered to its fields, right? If a crop fails, they starve.
But the Yamnaya could just pack up and leave.
Precisely. They had a mobile food supply. Over generations, this highly efficient mobile economy led to population growth that simply outpaced the existing farming groups in Europe.
So it's less of an invading army and more of an unstoppable, slow-motion demographic tide. They just kept moving their herds a few miles further out every generation, and eventually their numbers and their culture just saturated the landscape.
Yes, there was undoubtedly conflict and violent displacement along the way.
Yeah.
I mean, you don't have a massive demographic shift without friction, but the primary engine was economic and demographic momentum.
That makes a lot of sense.
And we see this exact same mechanism play out on other continents, too. Look at the Bantu expansion in Africa. Starting roughly 3,000 to 4,000 years ago, populations originating in West Central Africa, near modern-day Nigeria and Cameroon, began a massive expansion that eventually covered almost the entire sub-Saharan region.
And their advantage was a combination of agriculture and eventually ironworking, right?
Precisely. They possessed a package of agricultural technologies, specifically the farming of yams and sorghum, that allowed them to support much denser populations than the indigenous hunter-gatherer groups living in the central and southern forests.
So more food equals more people.
Yes, and later they acquired ironworking, which gave them superior tools for clearing dense jungle for agriculture. As their population grew, they expanded southward and eastward, bringing the vast Bantu language family with them. Today, hundreds of millions of people speak Bantu languages like Swahili and Zulu.
That's an incredible legacy.
It is. And again, modern genetics shows us this wasn't a total eradication of the previous inhabitants. We see the genetic signatures of ancient hunter-gatherer populations surviving in varying proportions across Africa today. It was a complex process of assimilation and intermarriage.
But if we're talking about expansions that push the absolute limits of human capability, we have to talk about the Austronesians. The sheer geographical scale of this migration is staggering.
It is unmatched.
Starting around 3500 BCE, seafarers originating from the region around Taiwan began expanding across the open oceans. Over thousands of years, they reached the Philippines, Indonesia, eventually pushing out into the deep Pacific to populate Hawaii, Easter Island, and New Zealand. But the part that absolutely blows my mind is that a branch of this migration went west.
Yes, across the Indian Ocean.
They crossed the entire expanse of the Indian Ocean and settled Madagascar, an island just off the east coast of Africa.
The settlement of Madagascar by Austronesian peoples is arguably one of the greatest maritime engineering and navigational feats in human history.
Seriously.
To put it in perspective, they were navigating a route from Southeast Asia across thousands of miles of deep, unpredictable ocean to hit a specific landmass off the African coast long before the invention of the magnetic compass.
See, this is where we have to confront our modern biases. We have this terrible habit of looking back at ancient non-Western peoples and unconsciously labeling them as primitive. But you do not accidentally drift on a log from Indonesia to Madagascar.
No, you certainly do not.
You can't just paddle hard and hope for the best. How do they actually do it? What were the mechanics of that kind of navigation?
Well, first, they used outrigger canoes, which are brilliantly engineered vessels. By attaching a parallel float to the main hull, you gain incredible stability in rough seas without sacrificing speed.
Oh, right, the little side pontoon things.
Exactly. But the real genius was in their navigation. Austronesian navigators developed complex mental models of the ocean. They memorized star maps, tracked the flight paths of specific seabirds, and most impressively, they learned to read the interference patterns of ocean swells.
Wait, what does that mean?
They could literally feel how waves bouncing off a distant unseen island changed the rhythm of the water beneath their boat.
No way! They could feel the island before they saw it.
Yes. It requires a mastery of applied physics and environmental observation that rivals any modern navigational technology.
It's an incredible testament to human ingenuity. But as much as I love talking about movement driven by innovation, curiosity, and opportunity, we can't tell the full story of human migration without transitioning into its darkest chapters.
That's right.
We have to confront the eras when human movement ceased being a choice and instead became a horrific, industrialized machinery of forced displacement.
It is a painful but absolutely essential component of the historical record. When we analyze migration, we must address the largest involuntary human displacement in history, which is the transatlantic slave trade.
Yeah.
Between the early 16th and the late 19th centuries, approximately 12.5 million enslaved Africans were forcibly transported across the Atlantic to the Americas.
The brutality of the logistics alone is sickening. Just the middle passage, the crossing itself, carried an estimated mortality rate of 15 to 20%.
It's unfathomable.
Millions of people dying of disease, starvation, and violence in the holds of ships. And for those who survived the crossing, they were thrust into a system of chattel slavery designed to strip away every conceivable form of human autonomy. But there's a specific, calculated tactic used by the enslavers that I want to dig into because it fundamentally shaped the cultural landscape of the Americas. Enslavers deliberately mixed distinct ethnic and linguistic groups together on the plantations.
Yes, they did. West and Central Africa were, and still are, incredibly diverse regions with hundreds of distinct languages, religions, and cultural traditions. When enslavers purchased human beings, they intentionally broke up groups of people who shared a common language or background.
So they couldn't even speak to each other.
Exactly. The logic behind this was cruel and purely pragmatic. It was a security measure. If the people you are enslaving cannot communicate with one another, they cannot easily organize collective resistance, coordinate escapes, or launch armed uprisings. It was a deliberate strategy of cultural isolation and erasure.
They were trying to sever every tie these individuals had to their past and to each other. But what strikes me is the incredible resilience of the human spirit in the face of that erasure. Because the result wasn't a void.
No, it wasn't.
Forced into this brutal crucible, people from disparate African backgrounds drew on fragments of their respective traditions, combined them with the realities of their enslavement, and forged something entirely new. They created Creole languages, new musical traditions, new syncretic religions. The deliberate destruction of diverse African cultures actually catalyzed the creation of a profound, resilient, synthesis African-American culture.
Yes.
You can chain a person's body, but you cannot extinguish the human drive to communicate and create culture.
That synthesis is a testament to cultural survival under the most extreme duress imaginable. And today, we are seeing a fascinating intersection between this history and the genetic science we discussed earlier.
Oh, right, with the DNA test.
Exactly. Because the system of chattel slavery legally defined human beings as property, the documentary records of their lives are practically non-existent. The ledgers recorded ages, genders, and prices, but they intentionally erased names, origins, and lineages.
So tracing your roots through paper is just impossible.
For centuries, for a descendant of enslaved people trying to trace their family tree back to a specific region in Africa, the paper trail simply vanished into a wall of systemic erasure.
Right. If the census just lists your ancestor as property, how do you ever find out where you came from? But this is where the biology steps in and acts as a corrective tool. Millions of African Americans are now utilizing genealogical DNA testing to bypass those destroyed historical records entirely.
Exactly. Genomic databases can now match specific segments of an individual's DNA with the genetic profiles of contemporary populations living in West and Central Africa. It allows people to discover ancestral ties to the Yoruba in Nigeria, the Mende in Sierra Leone, or the Akan in Ghana.
That is so powerful.
It is. The DNA serves as an unerasable biological historical archive. The ledgers tried to wipe the slate clean, but the truth was physically carried inside the descendants.
And while the transatlantic trade rightly commands immense historical attention, we also need to look at forced migration within borders. The internal U.S. slave trade between 1790 and 1860 was a demographic upheaval on a staggering scale.
A massive scale.
We're talking about 1 million enslaved people forcibly moved from the upper South places like Virginia and Maryland down into the deep South to feed the exploding, hyper-profitable cotton economy following the invention of the cotton gin.
1 million people uprooted internally. The economic engine of the Deep South required relentless labor, and the Upper South essentially became an exporter of human beings.
Just treating people like a cash crop.
Yes, and this massive internal migration caused a second wave of catastrophic family separation. Children torn from parents, spouses sold away from each other, marching hundreds of miles in coffles down to Louisiana and Mississippi. The generational trauma and the fundamental restructuring of the American economic and social fabric caused by this internal displacement is something historians are still working to fully document.
Which brings us face to face with the brutal reality that economics is often the prime mover of human bodies. The era of legalized chattel slavery has ended, thankfully, but the systemic, structural economic forces driving millions of people to move today remain incredibly powerful.
They do.
I want to transition into the modern era and look at the actual mechanics of contemporary economic migration. Why are people moving today, and what does it actually do to the economies they leave and the economies they join?
To set a baseline for this discussion, let's look at the data. As of 2020, the United Nations estimates there are roughly 280 million international migrants worldwide. That's about 3.6% of the global population. Now, while political persecution, armed conflict, and increasingly climate change are significant drivers of displacement, the overwhelming engine of contemporary international migration is economic. Specifically, it's driven by the massive wage differentials between nations.
Let's break down how that wage gap actually functions. If I'm a worker in a developing country, the wage difference between moving from a rural village to a big city in my own country might be noticeable, but the wage difference between staying in my country versus crossing an international border into a high-income country is astronomical.
It's life-changing.
Right. Like, if a nurse in Manila can make 10 times the salary doing the exact same labor in London or New York, the incentive to move is insurmountable. No realistic amount of local economic development in the short term is going to close a 1,000% wage gap.
That is the core economic reality. The incentive structure heavily favors movement. But where the public discourse often goes off the rails is in analyzing the economic impacts of this movement on the receiving countries.
Yeah, that's where things get really heated.
In political debates, you usually hear two extreme polarized narratives. Either immigration is a flawless economic miracle with zero downsides, or immigration is a catastrophic drain that destroys local economies. As economists study this, they find that both sweeping statements are statistically false. The reality is highly nuanced and depends entirely on the variables involved.
Right, so let's parse those variables. When we look at high-skill immigration, the data seems remarkably unified. When a country brings in highly educated workers, engineers, doctors, researchers, it clearly boosts innovation, increases patent applications, drives entrepreneurship, and raises overall productivity.
Right.
It's essentially a massive net positive for the receiving country's economy.
The consensus on high-skill immigration is indeed very strong. The economic friction, and therefore the political contention, largely centers on low-skill immigration.
Okay.
The standard economic models and the majority of empirical studies show that an influx of low-skill immigrant labor has a very small or completely negligible effect on the wages of native-born workers overall.
Wait, really? Overall?
Yeah. Overall, yes. The economy isn't a fixed pie. Immigrants consume goods, pay rent, and create demand, which expands the economy and creates jobs.
This is the lump of labor fallacy, right? The mistaken idea that there is only a fixed amount of work to be done, so if someone new arrives, they automatically steal a job from someone else.
Exactly. However, while the overall effect is neutral or positive, the studies do show negative wage impacts on a very specific subset of the population, which are workers who are close substitutes in the labor market.
Okay, what does close substitutes mean in practical terms?
It means workers who possess the exact same skill levels and are competing for the exact same entry-level jobs. In most advanced economies, the demographic most directly impacted by an influx of new low-skill immigrants is actually previous waves of immigrants, or the lowest-skilled native-born workers without high school diplomas.
Oh, I see.
They're the ones competing for the same positions in construction, agriculture, or hospitality. So while the macroeconomy grows, the microeconomic reality for that specific vulnerable demographic can involve wage depression or increased competition.
That makes the political tension much more understandable. It's not a hallucination, it's a localized economic pressure. And what about the fiscal impact? The argument over whether immigrants pay more in taxes than they take out in public services like schools and healthcare.
That calculation is entirely dependent on the time horizon you use. In the short term, a new immigrant family with children might consume more in public schooling and healthcare than they pay in local taxes, especially if they're working low-wage jobs.
That makes sense.
However, if you extend the time horizon to include the second generation, the children who go through the school system, learn the language, get higher-paying jobs, and pay taxes for their entire adult lives, the net fiscal impact turns overwhelmingly positive. Evaluating the economics of immigration requires a multi-generational lens, which our short-term political cycles are very bad at utilizing.
Okay, that covers the receiving countries. But I want to flip the map. What happens to the countries these people are leaving? There's a massive paradox here that I really struggle to wrap my head around. The brain drain versus remittances paradox.
Yes, that is a huge issue.
Help me understand the mechanics of this. On one hand, migrants send money back home remittances. The data shows that global remittances often dwarf official foreign aid. That sounds incredible. But on the other hand, you have the brain drain. It's like a developing nation exporting all of its best software engineers and doctors to the West.
Right.
The immigrants send back millions in cash, which is great for their families. But now the home country has no one to build its own tech infrastructure, staff its hospitals. How do development economists weigh the influx of cash against the loss of talent?
It is arguably one of the most agonizing trade-offs in development economics. Let's look at the benefits first. Remittances are direct, frictionless injections of capital directly into the hands of the people who need it most.
Without all the red tape.
Exactly. Unlike foreign aid, which can get bottlenecked by corrupt governments or inefficient NGOs, a remittance payment goes straight to a mother in a rural village. She uses it to build a sturdier roof, buy better fertilizer, or pay her children's school fees. It is incredibly efficient poverty reduction at the micro level.
Okay, so the micro effect is fantastic. But the macro effect is where it gets dangerous.
Yes. The macro structural cost is immense. Imagine a low-income country spends limited public funds to educate a doctor. The day that doctor graduates, they get a visa and move to London. The home country has just subsidized the healthcare system of a wealthy nation while losing a critical piece of its own human capital.
That is brutal.
In sectors like medicine and education, professionals are not easily replaceable. If a rural hospital loses its only surgeon, the remittances that surgeon sends home to their family cannot operate on a patient with appendicitis. The loss of that highly skilled talent severely stunts the long-term institutional development of the sending country. It creates a cycle of dependency on the cash while removing the very people needed to build a self-sustaining economy.
It's a total catch-22. But economic migration, even when it's driven by poverty and constrained choices, at least implies some level of agency. You choose to seek a better wage. But for a massive growing segment of the global population, moving isn't about optimizing a paycheck. It is about immediate physical survival.
Yes, survival migration.
And this brings us to a system that seems to be completely breaking apart under modern pressures, the global refugee framework.
To understand why the system is failing, we have to understand how it was built. The legal architecture governing refugees today rests almost entirely on the 1951 Refugee Convention and its 1967 Protocol. This framework established a profound principle in international law known as non-refoulement.
Non-refoulement. That's a term you hear thrown around a lot in policy debates, but how does it actually function at a border checkpoint?
Non-refoulement legally prohibits a state from returning an asylum seeker to a territory where their life or freedom would be threatened on account of their race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or political opinion.
Okay.
If a person arrives at a border and claims asylum under these criteria, international law dictates they must be given a fair hearing and they cannot be shoved back over the border into the hands of their persecutors. This system is overseen globally by the UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency.
But the critical flaw here is the historical context, right? The 1951 Convention was drafted in the immediate aftermath of World War II and the onset of the Cold War. It was explicitly designed for a very specific type of European political refugee fleeing state persecution.
Yes, like Soviet dissidents.
And it seems like this mid-century legal architecture is utterly collapsing under the realities of 2023. The data shows we have roughly 110 million forcibly displaced people globally right now. That is the highest number ever recorded in human history.
The sheer scale, and more importantly, the complexity of contemporary displacement is just overwhelming the mid-century design. We aren't just dealing with individual political dissidents fleeing the Soviet bloc anymore. We are seeing massive, chaotic, multi-year displacements driven by intractable civil wars, state collapse, and generalized violence in places like Syria, Afghanistan, Sudan, and Myanmar.
Which the system just wasn't built for.
The system wasn't built to process millions of people fleeing a multi-faction civil war simultaneously.
And it completely fails to address the most terrifying emerging driver of displacement, which is climate change. We have people whose islands in the Pacific are literally sinking into the ocean, or agricultural workers in sub-Saharan Africa whose farmland has turned to uninhabitable desert due to prolonged drought. They are moving because staying means death, but if they cross a border, they run into a legal wall.
Massive legal wall.
Because rising sea levels aren't persecuting you based on your religion or political opinion, they don't meet the 1951 definition of a refugee.
You've hit on a massive void in international law. There is currently no binding international legal framework that grants asylum to someone fleeing environmental collapse. They fall into a jurisdictional black hole.
It feels like relying on the 1951 Convention to manage modern displacement is like trying to use a paper map of a 1950s dirt road to navigate a modern, constantly shifting, multi-level superhighway. The map just fundamentally does not correspond to the reality of the terrain anymore.
That is a highly accurate assessment of the institutional failure. And this failure is compounded by a severe geographic imbalance. The legal obligation to grant asylum exists on paper for all signatory nations, but the physical reality of displacement dictates that the burden falls overwhelmingly on the countries right next door to the conflict.
Because if you're fleeing a war zone on foot, you don't book a flight to Canada, you walk to the nearest safe border.
Exactly. As a result, the vast majority of the world's refugees are hosted by low- and middle-income countries. Nations like Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, Pakistan, and Ethiopia are absorbing millions of displaced people.
Wow.
Lebanon, for instance, has at times hosted a refugee population equivalent to roughly a quarter of its own native population. These are nations that are arguably the least economically equipped to bear massive, sudden shocks to their infrastructure, housing markets, and healthcare systems. Meanwhile, wealthier developed nations, insulated by geography or oceans, debate taking in quotas of a few thousand people.
And when we objectively analyze the intensely polarized politics around refugees and migration in Western democracies, in Europe, the US, Australia, we have to view it through the lens of this broken system. As observers, maintaining impartial reporting here is critical. The friction we see in receiving societies is not entirely manufactured. It is a symptom of a structural reality.
It absolutely is.
There is a genuine logistical tension between the humanitarian obligation to help people fleeing death and the absorptive capacity, infrastructure limits, and political tolerance of the receiving societies. When the international burden-sharing mechanisms fail, that localized pressure generates intense nativist backlash.
That is the crucial takeaway. Much of the political volatility we witness in Western democracies is less about the inherent unworkability of migration and more a symptom of an international management system that is completely broken down. When a chaotic, unmanaged migration overwhelms local systems, it exacerbates anti-immigrant sentiment.
Let's shift from the politics to the cultural mechanics of what happens after people arrive. Because whether individuals are moving through a strained refugee system or arriving on highly coveted H-1B economic visas, or even if we look back thousands of years to the gradual expansion of the Yamnaya pastoralists, the arrival of new people inevitably and irrevocably alters the cultural fabric of a place.
Always.
How do societies actually process this collision of cultures?
Well, the study of this process is known as acculturation research, and it looks at how migrants and host societies interact over time. It's fascinating because the cultural consequences operate on a much longer timeline than immediate economic shocks, making them harder to quantify, but incredibly profound. Psychologists like John Barry developed models of acculturation, and the empirical findings consistently point to one specific strategy producing the best outcomes.
And by outcomes, we mean psychological well-being for the migrant and social cohesion for the society.
Correct. The research shows that integration is the most successful strategy. Now, integration has a specific definition here. It means a migrant maintains strong ties and participation in their original heritage culture, while simultaneously engaging fully and actively participating in the new majority culture.
So it's not a choice between the two.
Right. It's not choosing one or the other. It's balancing both.
This is where I think the historical record is so vital to bring into modern debates. There is often this deep-seated fear in nativist arguments about cultural replacement, this anxiety that if a new culture arrives, the existing native culture will be overwritten or erased, like taping over a VHS cassette.
That's a common fear, yes.
But the empirical reality of human history shows that societies are not zero-sum games. It's almost never a process of replacement. It's a process of addition and multiplication.
Societies are not hermetically sealed jars. They are permeable membranes. The entire historical record of humanity demonstrates a constant, dynamic process of selective adoption and hybrid formation.
The ultimate undeniable example of this is American culture. I would challenge anyone to try and define American music, American culinary traditions, or even American religious practices without the contributions of immigrants. The exercise is impossible. The result would be unrecognizable.
Completely.
If you look at jazz, it's a fusion of West African rhythmic traditions, European harmonic structures, and the lived experience of Black Americans in the South. Rock and roll, country music, the entire culinary landscape from pizza to tacos to barbecue, it is all a creative synthesis. It is built by successive waves of people bringing their specific ingredients to the pot.
And mixing them together.
Exactly. The strength of the culture isn't in keeping the ingredients rigidly separated. The strength is what happens when they undergo a chemical reaction together.
And if we want the most immediate, inescapable proof of how migration synthesizes culture, we don't even have to look at food or music. We only need to look at the very tool we are using to communicate this thought right now. The English language.
I absolutely love this part of the research. When you really drill into it, the English language is basically a monument to constant human movement. I like to think of a modern English sentence like a geological core sample. If you drill down into it, the topsoil is modern American corporate tech speak. But as you dig deeper, the bedrock is 5th century Germanic, and right in the middle is a massive, sudden layer of French ash.
That core sample analogy is perfect for tracing its evolution. The foundational bedrock of English was brought to the British Isles by the Anglo-Saxon migration tribes moving from northern Germany and Denmark in the 5th and 6th centuries. That gave us our core, everyday structural words like house, dog, water, and eat.
Okay.
Then you hit 1066. The Norman conquest deposits a massive layer of French vocabulary right on top of it. This is why English has this weird dual vocabulary for so many things.
Right, like the difference between the animal in the field and the meat on the table. The Anglo-Saxon peasants were raising the cow and the swine, but the French-speaking Norman aristocracy were eating the beef and the pork. The class division of a migration event is literally frozen in our vocabulary.
Exactly. And the migrations didn't stop there. During the Renaissance, the movement of scholars, texts, and ideas across Europe introduced a rich layer of Latin and Greek terminology, particularly for science and law.
So we just kept adding layers.
Yeah. Later, the horrific forced migrations and the colonial expansions of the British Empire spread the language globally, where it absorbed words from Hindi, Arabic, indigenous American languages, and dozens of others. And today, English functions as a global lingua franca, largely as a consequence of 20th century American economic and cultural expansion, which itself was fundamentally built on mass immigration.
So English is a language built by migrants. But what I find incredibly revealing is how this migrant-built language actually treats the modern vocabulary of movement. The words we use to describe people crossing borders today are incredibly loaded.
They are very heavy words.
We use terms like migrant, immigrant, emigrant, expat, refugee, asylum seeker, displaced person, undocumented immigrant, and illegal alien. People often use them interchangeably, but they aren't just synonyms.
They are far from synonyms. They are overlapping categories that carry vastly different legal statuses, political valences, and sociological framing. And objectively analyzing how we deploy this vocabulary is essential for modern cultural literacy. The choice between these terms is rarely, if ever, neutral.
Let's break down the framing. Take the contrast between the terms illegal alien and undocumented immigrant, which describe the exact same physical person standing in front of you.
The linguistic framing dictates the perception. The term illegal alien operates by framing the human being fundamentally as a legal violation. The noun alien emphasizes foreignness and non-belonging, while the adjective illegal defines their very existence in that space as a crime. It turns a person into a juridical object.
Right, it's very dehumanizing.
Conversely, the term undocumented immigrant utilizes a completely different framework. The noun immigrant anchors them as a human being engaged in a recognizable demographic process, while the adjective undocumented frames their status as an administrative issue, a person who currently lacks the complete paperwork required by the state.
It's fascinating because the grammar itself encodes a specific political position. Depending on which word you choose to pull from the dictionary, you are immediately subconsciously framing the listener's perception of the human being in question before you even make your argument.
Precisely. The language we use doesn't just describe reality, it shapes it. Understanding how legal and political positions are encoded into our everyday vocabulary allows us to navigate the immense complexities of modern discourse around migration. It lets you see the mechanics behind the arguments, rather than just reacting to the emotion of the words.
Okay, I want to take a breath and try to synthesize this incredible journey we've been on today.
It's been a long journey.
It really has. We started 300,000 years ago with our ancestors on the savannah, lacking thick fur, lacking aquatic adaptations, relying purely on behavioral flexibility, social cooperation, and a relentless drive to see what was over the next hill. We walked out of Africa.
We did.
We traced how scientists pulled genetic ghosts out of tiny bone fragments to map our footprints across oceans and steppes. We confronted the horrific industrialized eras of forced displacement, the slave trade, and the indelible complex marks those tragedies left on human DNA and culture.
Yeah.
We navigated the massive economic engines driving movement today, the catastrophic breaking point of our mid-century refugee systems, and finally, the beautiful, messy cultural synthesis that gave us the very language we are speaking right now.
When you lay it all out like that, it leads to a profound realization. The history of human migration is not a history of disruptions to normal life. Movement is the fundamental condition of human life. From the moment we evolved to sweat and run to the moment we built boats to cross the Pacific, we are, at our very core, the species that moves.
And that leaves me with a final provocative thought for you to mull over as we end today's deep dive. We've established that for hundreds of thousands of years, moving into the dangerous unknown is the most fundamentally human thing we do. Our ancestors stood on the shores of Asia, looked at 90 kilometers of open ocean without knowing what was on the other side, built a boat, and went.
And just went.
So, As climate shifts alter our current environment and as technology advances exponentially, what is our next ocean? When the time comes for interplanetary migration, when we start looking seriously at colonizing Mars or moons beyond our solar system, will we carry that same behavioral flexibility to the stars in our generic, unspecialized bodies? Will we terraform entire planets to suit our sweaty, tropical ape anatomy? Or, given the advances in genetic engineering, will the ultimate human migration be the one that finally requires us to intentionally change our own biology?